Dr. Celine Vex had always been in control. As a renowned xenobiologist from the Syrian colony on the distant world of Elysa 7, she prided herself on her scientific discipline. For years she had dedicated her life to studying the biology of alien species, observing the vast differences in physiology between the creatures of her world and those of the human race. She had seen many things in her career, some mundane, some extraordinary, but nothing could have prepared her for the discovery that would unfold on this particular day. It all started with a simple experiment, one that seemed innocuous enough at first. As part of a human-alien research exchange program, Dr. Vex had come to Earth under the auspices of the United Nations Earth Intergalactic Science Initiative. Her mission was to observe and document human biology in ways that hadn't been done before, while also contributing her knowledge of Syrian biology to the growing body of human research. Today, however, there was one small wrinkle in the plan, one that would alter the course of her mission in ways no one could have anticipated. Dr. Elijah Hayes, a human researcher who had been working in the same lab for several months, had been experimenting with human pheromones. The goal was simple enough: understand the effects of pheromones on both human and alien biology in a controlled environment. Given the growing interest in human bioengineering and social cohesion, the team believed there might be ways to manipulate human pheromones to improve communication, enhance emotional connections, or even modify human behavior. Celine had been invited to assist with the experiment. While she had no personal interest in human pheromones, she considered them a trivial aspect of biology compared to more complex phenomena. She knew it was a chance to learn. However, things were not going according to plan. The laboratory was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of fluorescent lights, save for the occasional hum of machinery. Elijah had prepared a small container that emitted a potent concentration of pheromones, intending to release them gradually into the room to study the reactions of the various subjects. Celine, curious but cautious, stood on the sidelines, her attention focused on her own research notes. "All right, Celine, we're ready to release the sample," Elijah said, his voice calm but excited. He adjusted his glasses, looking up from the small glass vial in his hands. "I know you're not particularly fond of this aspect of our research, but I think you'll find the results fascinating." She nodded absently, still focused on her notes. The pheromones were harmless, at least that's what Elijah had assured her. They were naturally derived from human glands and were designed to affect only the most basic, instinctual responses in humans. There was no immediate danger. No reason to worry. Elijah set the vial down on a nearby platform and activated the system, which began releasing the pheromones into the lab. Celine watched as a gentle mist filled the air, the slight fog drifting lazily toward her. At first, she didn't think much of it. She was accustomed to the strange and unfamiliar smells that came with working alongside humans. Syrians, her people, had a much more complex sense of smell than humans, and their pheromone systems were quite different, tied to complex chemical structures that acted as both communication tools and emotional regulators. But humans, it seemed, were simpler in their biochemical makeup. Their pheromones were not nearly as sophisticated as the Syrians, but had nonetheless evolved to play a vital role in human social interactions. Celine turned her attention back to her notes, but something changed. A sudden warmth flooded her body, creeping up from her chest and spreading to her limbs. It was subtle at first, just a slight increase in temperature, nothing to be alarmed about. But then the heat grew, becoming more intense. Her pulse quickened and her skin tingled as though it were reacting to an electric charge. "What is this?" She pushed away the unease that began to creep into her thoughts. She had studied human physiology extensively, and she knew that pheromones played a role in emotional regulation. Perhaps the concentration in the room was higher than expected, or maybe the release had affected her in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility for her to be impacted by the pheromones, but the intensity she was feeling was different. Her senses heightened. The faint smell of Elijah's cologne became overpowering, the sharp scent of the chemical mixtures in the lab almost suffocating. She could hear Elijah's heartbeat now, the rhythmic thrum of blood pumping through his veins. It felt invasive, yet somehow exhilarating. Her body was no longer under her control. Her skin, which had always been pale and smooth, felt almost feverish. Her breaths came faster, shallow, and she involuntarily clenched her fists. It was as though her entire biology was screaming for something, something primal, something that had never been a part of her normal, rational thought processes. Calm down, she told herself, forcing herself to focus. This is not your body's normal reaction. It is the pheromones. You must distance yourself. But the more she tried to rationalize, the stronger the sensations became. Her vision blurred momentarily, and when it cleared, she found herself closer to Elijah than she'd intended. He was standing a few feet away, eyes wide with concern. "Celine?" His voice was a distant echo, muffled by the overwhelming noise of her racing heart and the frantic, primal energy coursing through her veins. She turned toward him, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of vulnerability, a kind of invitation. Her instinct screamed at her to push him away, to maintain professional boundaries, but everything within her was rebelling. "This is wrong, this is not who you are," she thought, her breath hitching in her throat. "I need some air," she whispered, her voice thin and strained, the words barely making sense in her own ears. She staggered backward, her vision swimming as her body felt as though it were on fire. Elijah stepped forward, his hand reaching out to steady her. "Are you all right? You're looking flushed. Maybe we should end the experiment for today. I didn't realize it would have such an effect on you. It wasn't supposed to—" "I'll be fine," she interrupted quickly, her tone sharp. "Just a moment." She turned and fled from the room, her legs unsteady beneath her, her thoughts in a chaotic jumble. She couldn't think, she couldn't process. All she could do was focus on the one thing she felt she could control: escaping the lab. As she stepped into the hallway, the cool air was a welcome relief. She leaned against the wall, pressing her palms to her face, trying to steady herself. This cannot be happening. The pheromones had affected her in ways she could not explain. They had triggered something deep within her biology, something hidden, something that shouldn't exist in a species like hers. Syrians were not driven by biological urges the way humans were. They had no need for mating rituals or social bonds that relied on physical attraction. They were a rational, emotionally controlled people. But now Celine was not herself. Her body was reacting to something outside of her control. And it was terrifying. "What is happening to me?" Her body temperature was still rising, and every breath she took felt like a struggle. She closed her eyes and willed the sensations away, but they only grew stronger. It was as though her entire body had been rewired, transformed into something else, something human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the feeling surged into overdrive. Her skin prickled, her muscles spasmed involuntarily, and she felt a sharp pang deep in her core. It was like an electric shock, a rush of energy that cascaded through her veins. She couldn't breathe. Her body was betraying her. Frantically, she reached out to steady herself on the nearest surface, an ornate sculpture embedded in the wall, and tried to focus on the facts. What had caused this? What had gone wrong? The pheromones, yes, but why? Why now? And then it hit her. It wasn't just a physical reaction to the chemical stimuli. Something else was happening. Her body was changing. The implications of that thought sank in slowly. Her physiology had begun shifting in ways she could not comprehend. Her heart rate, her body's response to stimuli, her heightened senses, all of it was proof that something deep within her biology had been unlocked. Something that she had no control over. She gripped the sculpture tighter, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just reacting to the pheromones. She was becoming something else, something that would change everything. Her body, for the first time in her life, felt entirely out of her control, and there was no going back. Chapter. Celine Vex staggered out of the lab, her breath shallow and uneven. The cool air of the hallway hit her like a shock, but it wasn't enough to quell the strange, almost feverish heat still burning inside her. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself, but her body refused to obey. Her heart raced, pounding against her ribcage in a way she had never experienced before. Every pulse of blood seemed to reverberate throughout her entire being, creating a dull thrum in her head. Her skin, usually cool and pale as the moon, felt like it was on fire. A slick sheen of sweat covered her forehead, and her stomach clenched with an unfamiliar hunger that had nothing to do with food. This can't be happening, she thought, the words feeling foreign in her mind. She was a scientist, a rational being who studied logic and reason. She was trained to control her emotions, her body, to understand the processes behind every biological reaction she experienced. But now, as she gasped for air in the sterile corridor, she felt utterly powerless. Her body was no longer her own. The pheromones, the human pheromones, had done something to her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had been exposed to pheromones before, of course. During her time on Elysa 7, Syrians studied the chemical signals of many species, including humans. But never had she felt such a violent reaction. The pheromones, while potent, were supposed to provoke mild emotional responses. A bit of attraction, maybe a spike in heart rate or body temperature, but nothing like this. What was this? Was it some kind of alien response that had never been documented? Or perhaps her own biology was adapting to the presence of the pheromones in ways the scientists had never predicted. No, she thought, shaking her head in an attempt to clear the fog. This is more than that. This is different. Her instincts, the ones she had long suppressed, began to rise to the surface. It was as though the pheromones had unlocked something primal, something hidden beneath the layers of her rational mind. Her biology was reacting in ways she had never imagined. It wasn't just about her emotions anymore. It was about something more fundamental, something tied to her physical form. Get a hold of yourself, she told herself sternly, breathing deeply in an attempt to steady her pulse. You're a Syrian. You can control this. But as she stood there, trembling slightly, she realized that she couldn't control it. Not anymore. The heat was building. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, this intense need, this surge of energy coursing through her veins. She didn't understand it, but it was there, undeniable, and growing stronger by the second, a pressure deep within her chest, right where her heart was pounding. It was a tightness, a hunger, a thirst for something that wasn't food, wasn't water, wasn't science. She felt as though she might burst at the seams, her body being pulled in every direction at once. She pushed herself off the wall, determined to find a place where she could be alone, away from Elijah and the others. As she walked down the hallway, her senses felt warped. The lights overhead flickered for a moment, their buzzing sound too sharp in her heightened ears. She could hear footsteps from the floor below, the distant murmur of conversations she couldn't make out. The sounds were too loud, the lights were too bright, and the smells. There was an overwhelming, sharp scent of coffee and something sweet coming from a nearby break room. It was all too much. Too intense, too real. She needed to get away. Her feet carried her toward the nearest exit, her mind a storm of confusion. She had to find a place where she could think, a place where she could regain some semblance of control over her body and her thoughts. She entered the small lab she had been assigned, a quiet corner of the facility, its walls lined with monitors and bioanalyzers that hummed with life. The door clicked shut behind her as she stumbled into the room. The heat surged again, but this time it wasn't just physical. Her body's senses were heightened in ways that left her dizzy. She could feel her pulse in every extremity. The sound of her breathing was unnervingly loud in her ears. Her vision was sharper than it had ever been, but also somehow unfocused. The world around her blurred into a haze as she dropped onto the nearest chair and grasped the edge of the table to steady herself. I need to calm down, she thought desperately, pressing her palms against her forehead as though she could force the heat to subside, but the sensation wouldn't relent. It was as if her own biology was betraying her, stripping away the control she had so carefully maintained. The rational, scientific part of her mind fought against the tidal wave of raw, unfiltered sensation that flooded her every sense. A low growl escaped her throat, but she quickly stilled herself, the sound disorienting. It felt like something far deeper was pushing to the surface, something far more animalistic than anything she had experienced before. She never considered herself a slave to instinct. Syrians were bred for intellect, for rational thinking, for control. Their evolution was centered on the mastery of knowledge, not emotional whims. Yet now, as she sat in the sterile lab with her hands clenched into fists, she could feel something ancient, something buried beneath her carefully constructed layers, rising to the surface. No, she thought, trying to repress the overwhelming sensation. I must resist. but resistance was becoming increasingly difficult. The door to the lab slid open, and she heard a familiar voice calling out to her. "Celine? Are you all right? You were acting strangely in the lab. You left so suddenly. What's happening?" It was Elijah. His voice sounded distant, as though his words were muffled by a thick fog. She looked up, trying to focus on him, but her vision wavered. "I'm fine," she managed to say, her voice strained, her eyes locked onto him, but everything in her body screamed to look away, to distance herself, but she couldn't. His presence was like a magnet pulling her toward him, a gravitational force that she didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. Her heart pounded as her gaze lingered on him. He was human, so utterly human, and yet, in this moment, he felt like something otherworldly. Every movement, every breath he took, felt heightened, electric. "Celine, you don't look fine," Elijah said, his voice softening with concern. "Your pulse is elevated, your skin's flushed, you're trembling. Are you sick? You've never reacted to the pheromones like this before. Are you sure?" "I said I'm fine," she interrupted, her voice firmer than she intended. She forced herself to stand, but the movement was uncoordinated, unsteady. She felt lightheaded, and her legs wobbled beneath her. She grasped the table for support, her fingers curling around the edge. Elijah took a step closer, his brow furrowing with worry. "Celine, please." The heat flared again, but this time it felt different. This time it didn't just spread through her body, it focused, centered in her chest, a tight, almost suffocating pressure that built with each passing second. Her body had never been so out of control. Elijah was too close. She could smell his scent, his cologne, the subtle, intoxicating musk of his skin. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the warmth of his body so close to hers. She wanted to pull away, but something inside her resisted. "Elijah, stay back," she said, her voice thick with something unrecognizable. It wasn't just warning anymore. It was a plea, a desperate cry for distance, but her body wouldn't listen. The space between them closed, and her chest tightened with a sensation that felt dangerous. She didn't know if she wanted to push him away or pull him closer. The confusion gnawed at her, the urge to act on these primal impulses, both foreign and terrifying. "You're not fine," Elijah insisted gently, but now his voice had a soft edge to it, one she hadn't heard before. "You're in pain, Celine. Something's happening to you. What do I need to do to help?" He reached out, his hand tentative, but she recoiled, her back hitting the edge of the table as she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I don't know." Her entire body ached. Every inch of her skin was alive with heat, every nerve ending screaming for release. She didn't understand what was happening, but it was growing stronger, more intense with each passing moment. Elijah's hand lingered in the air between them, and in that moment Celine realized something terrifying. She was losing herself. Her rational mind, her scientific reasoning, was slipping away as the heat within her grew unbearable. Every part of her screamed for relief, for release, but it wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something primal, and it was taking over. The heat in Celine's chest burned with increasing intensity. It was as though her entire body was alight with energy, her every nerve straining to control the force surging within her. She could feel the oppressive weight of it pressing against her, squeezing her chest, clouding her mind. A primal urgency clawed at her insides. An insatiable hunger she couldn't understand. A need so fundamental it transcended thought. She gasped for air, her breath sharp and uneven. Her body trembled, her skin still flushed with feverish heat, and her head spun as though she had been caught in a vortex, pulled from one reality into another. The sterile scent of the lab, the metallic tang of machinery, the soft hum of the monitors. They were all so distant now, so far removed from her present state. Everything, including Elijah's concerned gaze, felt hazy and out of reach. "Selny." Elijah's voice was softer now, full of caution and worry. He had moved closer, his presence wrapping around her like a tangible force. The air between them seemed thick with something neither of them could name. His hand hovered just inches away from her arm, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away from him, nor could she bring herself to allow him any closer. His scent, a subtle mixture of his cologne and something deeper, more human, filled the air, adding to the chaos inside her. The tension between them was palpable, thick like a fog that neither of them could pierce. She knew she should push him away, maintain the professional distance that had always defined their interactions, but her body refused to obey. Every cell in her body screamed for his presence, even as her mind fought to understand what was happening. "Why is this happening?" she thought desperately. Her voice, when it came, was weak, laced with confusion and fear. "Elijah, I don't know what's happening," she whispered, her words thick and strained. This isn't just the pheromones, it's more. Something is changing inside me." Elijah's brow furrowed, and his gaze flicked over her, as though trying to piece together the puzzle of what was unfolding before him. He reached forward, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, and the simple touch sent an electric shiver through her. "I can't make sense of this," he admitted softly. "You've never reacted to the pheromones like this before. I didn't even think it was possible for someone from your species to experience such a reaction. Syrians don't have the same biochemical reactions we do, but it's more than just science." Celine's mind spun in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, the heat in her chest rising, burning brighter, fiercer. She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to regain control, but it was futile. This feeling, this alien heat, was beyond her control. She was no longer the calm, rational scientist she had always been. She was something else entirely. Her body, once perfectly aligned with her will, was no longer her own. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, the way her senses had sharpened, the way her skin felt stretched tight over her muscles, the way her pulse hammered in her ears. She felt everything more acutely than she ever had before. Her breath hitched, and her body involuntarily swayed toward Elijah. It was as though there was a magnetic pull between them, an undeniable force that her mind couldn't resist. She hated the sensation, hated how weak she felt, but it was overpowering. "Get away from me," she choked out, but her words lacked conviction. The hunger inside her was too strong, and she didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. Elijah froze, his hand still hovering near her, but there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. Concern mixed with something else, something deeper, perhaps even more dangerous. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, almost pleading, her voice cracking as she spoke. She had to stop this, whatever this was. She didn't understand it, but she knew it wasn't safe, not for her, not for him. But her words seemed to have the opposite effect. Elijah's expression softened, and he took another step closer, his face inches from hers. He reached out again, this time taking her hand gently in his. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a jolt through her, as though the heat inside her body responded to his touch. "Celine," Elijah said, his voice low and soothing. "You're not going to hurt me, but you can't keep running from this either. Whatever's happening to you, whatever's changing inside you, I want to help. I don't understand it either, but I won't leave you alone in this." The sincerity in his voice, the unwavering calm in his demeanor cracked something inside her. The hunger inside her shifted slightly, no longer a vicious, clawing need, but a desperate plea for connection. A part of her wanted to push him away, wanted to tell him to leave and give her space, but another part of her, the part that was growing increasingly difficult to control, wanted him to stay, needed him to stay. Celine's breath grew ragged, the heat in her body surging again, and she instinctively pulled her hand from his, backing away. But her legs felt weak, and the sudden movement made her stumble, nearly falling into the table behind her. Elijah caught her in an instant, his arms wrapping around her to steady her. She felt the warmth of his body, the strong muscles beneath his shirt, and her own body reacted with a sharp pang of need. She pushed against him, the movement awkward and frantic. "Please," she gasped. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to stop it." He didn't let go of her, though. His arms were firm but gentle, holding her steady as if he feared she might fall apart if he let go. "I won't let you fall, Celine," he said quietly, his voice filled with both reassurance and a tinge of something else. It was a voice she hadn't heard from him before, softer, more intimate. Her heart pounded against her ribs as the heat inside her body threatened to overwhelm her. She could feel it now, something deep within her biological makeup, something that had been dormant, perhaps even hidden from her, now awakening with an intensity she couldn't explain. She closed her eyes, shaking her head, trying to force the thoughts away. Her mind screamed at her to remain logical, to push away the irrational pull that had begun to govern her every instinct, but it was impossible. A low, guttural sound left her throat before she could stop it, and she stiffened, horrified by the animalistic noise. It wasn't a sound a rational being made, and it terrified her more than she wanted to admit. "Celine?" Elijah's voice was soft, almost a whisper now, as though afraid he might shatter her fragile composure. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. "What's happening to you? Please, tell me." She opened her eyes, her pupils dilated, and her breath hitched in her throat. She could feel the pull toward him again, an overwhelming urge to close the distance between them, to allow the heat inside her to consume her and him both. But she didn't want that. She didn't want to hurt him. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All that escaped was a soft gasp as the heat inside her surged again, stronger this time, too much to ignore. She could feel the changes happening within her body, the way her heart seemed to beat in sync with the very essence of her being. She could feel the shifting, the changing. It was as though she were evolving in real time, becoming something she wasn't. The overwhelming pull toward Elijah intensified. He was the only thing in the room, the only thing in her world at that moment. Every breath she took seemed to pull her closer to him, and the confusion only deepened the need. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice shaky with desperation. "I don't know what I'm becoming." He stepped closer, his face now inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I don't know either," he murmured, his voice a soft comfort amid the chaos inside her. "But I'll be here for you, Celine. I won't let you face this alone." Her mind screamed at her to resist, to stop herself from giving in, from crossing whatever line she knew she shouldn't, but her body refused to listen. The heat surged one final time, and she found herself closing the distance between them, her breath shallow and erratic. She could feel the warmth of his body pressing against hers, and every logical thought in her mind dissolved into the all-consuming pull of the hunger that had taken over her. In that moment she understood. It wasn't just the chemical reaction. There was something far deeper, something she couldn't control, that had been triggered in her biology, a deep, instinctual part of her that was awakening. She didn't know if it was her alien nature or something entirely new, but she could no longer deny it. She was no longer the scientist, the rational observer. She had become something else, something powerful, and in that moment she had no choice but to accept it,